Good afternoon, everyone. My apologies, but my president called a last-minute meeting, and I had to be in attendance. And you all know what happens when the boss calls a meeting. So, my apologies. All right.
Interesting times.
Agenda, Terry, is that possible to pull it up?
I got it right here. All right, can we see that?
I just need you to scroll down a bit.
No, duh.
All right, fantastic. So again, my apologies, everyone. I would like to call to order the Subcommittee of Curriculum and Programs. Today is Wednesday, September 30th, and it is 4:37. And Terry, could we call the roll?
Yes. Ms. Hurst.
Present.
Ms. Gresham is absent, and Ms. Naylor.
Present.
Fantastic. All right, the first agenda item is vote to recommend to the full school committee that it approve the revisions of the anti-harassment policy SPS employees. Superintendent Warwick?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Melissa and Mary Jo to take the lead on this.
Sure.
Sure. So the first policy, the anti-harassment policy, SPS employees, and the next policy, the unlawful harassment of students policy, basically changes to the existing policy, anti-harassment policy. There have been some recent changes to Title IX, resulting in a change or a need to change the existing policy to make it, I guess, simpler to understand. What we did was, rather than, we took the one policy that combined the employees and the students and separated it out into two separate policies, two separate documents, I should say. So Katie O'Sullivan, who's also in attendance at the meeting, she is our current Title IX coordinator. So at this point, if that's okay with committee's approval, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to review.
Harry, can I also share my screen?
Let me stop sharing. And where's my?
And while you're doing that, Terry, I also wanted to mention we have Matt Grimes with us as well. He's our talent acquisition diversity and inclusion administrator in HR as well. He's also going to discuss a little later with regard to the policies with regard to the inclusion and retention aspects.
You all set, Katie, to share?
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
I'm not sharing, so I'm not sure.
That's my bad. You're good now.
Oh, I got it.
Thanks, Brandon.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Just some information that Melissa already shared. The SPS policy is being amended because the United States Department of Education the Office of Civil Rights amended the existing Title IX regulations, which became effective August 14th, 2020. So any Title I sexual harassment claims that come after August 14th will be under the new policy. Anything that happened prior is under the past one. There's no retroactive in these Title IX regulations. We are all familiar with Title IX. I just shared that information in case we needed it. The major changes to Title IX and the changes to the Springfield Public School policy are: one, the Title IX definition of sexual harassment has changed. When and how schools respond to and investigate allegations of misconduct.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt. Madam Chair, Brenda just posted that if the slides can be a little bigger so that as they're recording, the folks can see it.
Yeah, I just saw that. I was going to say thank you so much. Yes, Katie,
Sorry.
If you make it a full slideshow,
Yes, you're right.
run the actual PowerPoint. I don't know if that's easier for you. Yeah, then the viewing audience can see it.
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you very much. Sorry
Thanks,
for
Latonia and Brendan.
harassing.
No, that's all
Oh,
right.
that's
Thank
okay,
you.
great.
Thanks, Brendan.
So these are the three major areas of change that impacted the harassment policy, and they are inclusive of the Title IX. So under Title IX, the definition of sexual harassment now includes this. This is the first time that Title IX actually codifies the definition of sexual harassment, and these are the five areas of definition for it. It is also in the policy.
I was just going to chime in and indicate these are all contained within the policy. I know Katie's giving you some highlights of the policy itself.
Correct. Thank you, Melissa. When and how schools respond to and investigate allegations. Some small changes under Title IX. SPS is required to investigate every formal complaint and respond meaningfully to every known report of sexual harassment. Also, Title IX highlights the importance of supportive measures designed to preserve or restore access to any programming or activity in which the respondent or complainant is dealing with. And that is to be done as soon as possible. And then there's some procedurals and due process requirement changes that have happened through Title IX. Here are some of the highlighted ones that are the biggest difference. Bullet number 2, there can no longer be a single investigator model. There has to be a decision maker other than the Title IX coordinator or the investigator. The investigator cannot be the decision maker at the same time. The preponderance of evidence standard is now being used, and that is more likely than not that the sexual harassment has occurred. There's equal access opportunities for parties to appeal. And then in regards to record keeping, the Springfield Public Schools must maintain all documentations, investigations for a period of 7 years. And those are the changes to the employee piece because prior, like Melissa said, it was a policy that included both the employee and the student. But these are the major highlighted changes based on the Title IX changes. Are there any questions? Okay. Now for the unlawful harassment of students. It's important to note that the employee changes are similar to the student changes, and the policies have been separated to be able to address how other claims of unlawful discrimination are being handled as well, because this does not only refer to sexual harassment, but it's other forms of harassment as well are in the policy. This is just the opening information piece, how harassment of students by other students' employees will not be tolerated in the Springfield Public Schools. And again, these are the same changes, come out of the same format, but this student harassment policy now models the Massachusetts school committee policy. It follows the same framework that has already been released. Again, the same major changes that we spoke about in the employee changes. There's only one difference in the definition of sexual harassment for the students compared to the employers, which falls under the last bullet. There is, because of students' age and consent, there is additional language here for the student piece. That is not in the employee
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Just in looking at both of the policies, the employee and the student, is this policy only like on an individual to individual basis? And I guess I'm asking a leading question because I know we have other policies. If I'm not mistaken, Attorney Kennedy, I think we also have like a social media policy and stuff like that. So I guess my question is, how do these tie into if there are situations, for example, where somebody makes comments or whatnot or does things on social media that may be directed to a specific student or maybe something that multiple students may perceive as offensive or engaging inappropriately. Would that be something that would fall under this, Attorney Kennedy, or is that under the social media policy?
It could, social media policy, or it could be like the bullying policy as well. So there's some
Okay.
overlap of policies here that that relate to other student conduct. So you could have conduct that might fall into, and that's what things you're going to have to look at when you get a complaint is, does this conduct fall into the bullying policy? Does this conduct fall into the harassment policy? Does it fall into both? And they need to make sure that they are addressed by both of them. Or the conduct could also be a violation of a social media policy, but as well as a complaint under the student harassment policy. And I just want to interject one other point is this is a little confused. This whole changes to the timeline are a little confusing because all of a sudden the Department of Ed, the U.S. Department of Ed came down and said, for Title IX purposes, sexual harassment involving students, there's specific requirements that you have to follow. And that's what Ms. O'Sullivan went over and have been why they're required the changes to the policy. But it doesn't preclude that we don't have to, pardon me, those specific requirements that now the federal, the Department of Ed is requiring for sexual harassment of students and of employees, we don't have to follow that process with respect to other types of other unlawful harassment that are protected under the law or for the bullying policy. But we are required to do it for Title IX purposes. And that's why we had to carve out in these policies for Title IX what we have to do and follow. And that's why you might see in these policies with respect to other types of harassment, we don't have to follow that rigorous requirements there that are set forth by the Department of Ed.
Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that. And I think that's kind of why I asked the question that I did, because I think the concern that I have immediately, especially when you bring up the bullying policy, is that folks will ask, well, why is it that we're not taking these extreme measures for that policy, which is one that people always point out, right? And we always refer them to, or at least I do, always refer them to the harassment, because a lot of times harassment is not as stringent a requirement as bullying is. Like the definition of what we call bullying is much different. So with that being said, I guess I understand why legally we have to be looking at this and legally we have to make a decision on this. But I guess the concern that I then have is, and I'm kind of thinking my thoughts out right now, so forgive me if I don't articulate them the way that I want to at the moment. But I really want to hone in on the fact that, especially when it comes to the internet and social media, there's just such this wide opening of opportunity for people to do things that are very egregious to other folks. And so I guess my concern is just thinking about it as a school committee member is how do we, not only when it's specific to sexual harassment, but any type of harassment, like thinking about now internalizing how do we make sure that we're responding to those complaints in such a thorough formality as we are now going to be responding to these complaints specifically about sexual harassment. I guess. I think I got it all out.
I think that although there's these rigorous requirements for sexual harassment, by no means is the district taking the position or the school committee is taking the position that other forms of unlawful harassment are not as serious. And I think that they are still all being addressed and investigated appropriately. It's just that there's specific requirements for Title IX, and we're not suggesting, and I do have to pause, there has been some pushback by various attorney generals throughout the United States that have filed actually a lawsuit. In fact, our attorney general is joined in on that lawsuit because there's some objections to some of the requirements in these regulations that came out. So although we're required to have these specific requirements in the policy, some of them are still sort of being disputed and are being addressed by the courts. So some of these, unfortunately, may or may not be subject to change depending on how that court decision plays out.
And we do take all forms of unlawful harassment and retaliation seriously. Even in Massachusetts with the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, going back to 1996, they've had guidelines and recommendations with regard to processes and procedures. So I did want to let you know with regard to all forms of unlawful harassment.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Naylor. Any other questions that we have? I just have one really quick one, Attorney Kennedy. So is it fair to say, though, that this is all of the language that Mrs. O'Sullivan has presented, this is how it's been presented and this is what's being adopted? Like, this isn't necessarily our language, but this is what came down out of the federal office. Okay.
Yes.
Just
changes, the Title IX changes, they're very detailed regulations and requirements, and yes, and that's what we're included in the policy. But trying to also keep, with respect to other unlawful harassment, the policy as it existed before, particularly with respect to employees. So that's why you'll see in the employees harassment policy, unlawful harassment policy, there's a section that says not including Title IX, but because we want to keep that in there so that people are clear about where they would go and how it should be addressed, depending on what type of claim it is.
okay, thank you. I asked that question because I too had some concerns around just social media and cyber harassment. So if there are other policies that also cross and or will be referenced if something were to come up, then that's fine. Ms. Naylor, would you make a motion to approve? And I'm so sorry, Terry, would you make a motion to present the Title IX updated policy to the full committee?
So moved.
Second, all in favor, roll call vote is required.
For Ms. Hurst,
Yes.
Ms. Gresham is absent. Ms. Naylor.
Yes.
Sufficient vote, this matter passes. Thank you, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Thank you, Attorney Kennedy. All right, the next item on the agenda.
I will get it up right now.
And so-
Terry, you want me
Yeah?
to stop sharing?
Oh, please. Did you already? Where is it? I just lost it. Hold on one second, guys. I do know what I'm doing, so just want to let you know that.
We knew that.
Okay.
And just to clarify, that was a motion to recommend to the full committee for both the employee and the student policy. That was what was made, just to clarify.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
My goodness. I'm sorry, guys. It keeps disappearing. Here we go. Do we see it?
Oh, yeah.
What is the problem? Okay, Brandon, I think there's a problem. I can't share my screen.
You clicked the share screen button on the bottom
I did.
and then selected the window and chose share in the bottom right of that window.
So I'm gonna try and pull it up from my phone and I can just read the next item on the agenda unless someone happens to have it.
I got it. There we go.
Got it?
There you go.
Got it,
All right,
guys.
fantastic. So the second item on the agenda is vote to recommend to the full school committee that it approves the revisions to the unlawful harassment of students policy. Is that, I'm sorry,
Yeah, that's the one we covered. We covered both of
Fantastic.
those. So we're
So
on to
those
number
are-
3. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So the third item would be vote to recommend to the full school committee that it approve the non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity policy.
Harry, can you please allow me to share the screen again? Okay, and the last one that I have for you this evening is non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity. This is a policy that was generated in response to the DESE's guidance on gender identity. The policy clarifies issues relating to use of restroom, how students are to be able to be identified, and maintaining records and regarding name changes for gender identity purposes. The policy will specifically provide a prohibition, on discrimination and harassment on the basis of gender identity. Gender identity is a protected characteristic that is covered under the Springfield Public School harassment policy and is named in that policy as well. Are there any specific questions in regarding to the issues related to that policy?
So
Mary Jo?
just additional point that this applies to both students as well as employees. So Human Resources looked at this policy and made recommendations regarding employees. And then we also vetted this with the chief schools officers to get their input on as it relates to students.
So do we actually have the policy before us? Are you going to present that, Ms. O'Sullivan?
You should have, Terry presented the policy to you ahead of time. What I just wanted to give you was the 30,000 foot, but if you want me to go into details regarding the use of restroom, how students are to be able to identity, I can for you.
So I guess I have a couple of questions and then I'll open it up to see if Ms. Naylor has any. One is, were we only specifying restrooms? Because I feel like at one point we had taken up even the use of the gym locker rooms.
Yes.
The locker room spaces. And then 2, are we using signage that is non-gender binary?
So to the first part of your question, the policy will cover student access for restrooms, locker rooms, and changing facilities that correspond to the student's gender identity. And that's not limited to the use of private areas, gender neutral restroom, gender neutral changing room, nurses restroom, or nurse's office. Also separate changing schedule or private area within a public area. So it is not just the use of the restroom.
Ms. Naylor, do you have any questions?
I'm going to ask a question, and forgive me if it sounds ignorant, but I'm not sure if I'm going to say this politically correct, but I'm going to do my best. So when it comes to students' identification of gender, at what point is it that they are considered identified as whatever the new gender is? Is it by them stating to the teacher that they are now going by a different gender? Is it a documentation or process where a name change is taking place? What does this look like? And I only ask this question because in other districts, there have been concerns around students who have identified as another gender and then but they're not really identifying in all places and spaces. And so there were concerns by folks as to whether or not folks are actually identifying and being true to what they're identifying as, or just saying that they're identifying as for purposes of convenience. I don't know if that went out the way that I intended it to, but I just wanted to make sure that there were concerns that some of the constituents have expressed, and just making sure that there's an understanding of what that means and when that's made official.
Mary
Katie,
Jo?
if you stop
Sure.
sharing the PowerPoint, I can highlight that section in the policy that responds to that particular question.
Perfect. That'd be great,
Thank
because
you.
those questions are, Ms. Naylor's questions, I think, are addressed in that on the bottom of the first page of the policy.
Thank you. I was looking at it and I'm like, we're looking for the response. I couldn't find it. So I said, let me just get it out and ask.
So what you're seeing here is, the red line changes, just to clarify, is that this is DESE's guidance, and we took DESE's guidance and used that as our model to make the changes. And then working with the districts, either with the CSOs or the human resources, we added some more, fine-tuned that. So there really was no change here to the issues that are in the, on names and pronouns as to what was being, what DESE was recommending. So a student has a right to choose a name and a pronoun appropriate to the student's gender identity, regardless of the student's assigned birth and sex and name that appears on the student's birth certificate. Schools should accurately record and use the student's chosen name and pronouns that are consistent with the student's gender identity. Court orders are not required to update student records to reflect changes in the student's name and gender markers. And then depending on the age of the student, the school will work with the student and the parent and guardians on that, depending on if they're younger students or older students.
Okay, so for clarification purposes, if a child who is on their birth certificate identified as a female, who is then now identifying as a male, says that they are now identifying as a male, there is a notification process that they have to make with the school to let them know that this is the case, and then not requiring a court order, but basically by them notifying the school, then the expectation is now that child is to be identified based on the gender that they've now notified to the school at that point. Is that accurate?
Yes,
Okay.
Melissa is sharing, Ms. Shea is sharing her page. Right down, there's a privacy, confidentiality, and student records. That area, then those records are maintained. So records with a student's assigned birth name and sex, name change for gender identity purposes, gender transition, medical information related to gender identity, or other information of a similar nature. If those records exist, so if we're given some documentation on that, it has to be maintained in a separate confidential file with the school principal.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Those
the
records then
clarification.
would follow the student when the student leaves the elementary or middle school and goes on to the high school or middle school, that those records will follow in a confidential file.
Thank you.
Are there
And
any
then the
additional?
last part of the policy goes back to the question that Ms. Hurst had asked about whether it only applies to the restrooms. So that part talks about restrooms, locker rooms, and changing facilities.
I'm sorry, can I just ask one quick question? I was trying to read the policy at the same time, and then my neighbor came by. But, so, Attorney Kennedy, under, and I can't move it myself, but it, yeah, could you come down just to, okay, right there. Not for the younger students. So anybody, is it being assumed that anyone that's considered younger is those that are in elementary, and then middle and high school are the other students that we're referring to?
Yeah,
Because it says typically an elementary student, quote unquote, a younger student.
we didn't want to make that judgment call. So I think we were saying typically an elementary student rather than putting an age to it.
So we're saying, so
So essentially, when are you going to get the parents and guardians involved in this conversation? And
that's what I was going
that's
to,
where
that's the,
it's typically going to be when it's an elementary school student.
okay. But otherwise, for middle and high school, is it safe to then assume that the way that this policy reads is that that would be kept confidential?
Yes, and the school would just work directly with the student.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So I may ask another question. So are all of these suggestions as far as these changes to the policy, are these DESE mandated changes or are these suggestions by DESE?
So the changes you're seeing here it's Jesse's guidance that is on its website, and then we made additional changes to the policy. For example, we just didn't want it to say unlawful against harassment. We wanted to identify the types of harassment that might relate to gender identity, sex, sexual orientation. We added, why you see highlighted homosexuality, transgender status, is that over the summer, the U.S. Supreme Court had some decisions that addressed and used those terms in its decision regarding discrimination. So we added those in here as well.
I guess the biggest concern that I have is the question about when we engage parents. And that's kind of why I asked the question as well, as to when we make the decision as, you know, at what point do we now identify this student as whatever gender that they are now identifying as or pronoun. And so having such a vague area of not identifying, even saying younger students, I mean, there's a lot of people that will consider a sixth grader a younger person. My daughter's 11, she's in sixth grade. So I think she doesn't need to be making those kind of decisions without me being aware as a parent. So I think my biggest issue with this is that point of when we actually engage parents in the conversation, and why is it that we're not required to engage parents sooner? I can see if they're 16 or older because they can sign themselves out of school at 16. But for me to think of an 11 or 12-year-old who may be having some decisions and questions and not encouraged to talk to an adult, even if it's not their parent, I just feel like I'm concerned about that. So that's why I asked the question, is it a mandate? Because if it's a mandate by DESE, obviously we have to do what the state is telling us to do legally. But if it's not a mandate in a suggestive language or guidance, then I'm really having some pushback on that. I'm really feeling strongly about that.
That's a good question. And this is not mandated by DESE. It is a guidance by DESE. And the language where we said, where we added here, typically an elementary student, that was something that the CSOs were discussing. There could be just further discussion on that. That was a recommendation after talking with the CSOs, that we identify what a younger student is. And I think it's going to your point, Ms. Naylor, is like, what's a younger student? And do we put, and that's why we didn't really want to put a particular age on it, but that's what we say typically in elementary schools, elementary student. So that there is, that is not mandated by DESE, you know, the age of that student. And here it's, and to just read the sentence again, schools will work with the student and the parents and guardians of the students if they're involved in the process. Certainly, if the student has told his or her parents or their parents, then you would work with those parents and guardians. But if it's but if they're not involved in the process, then and they're a younger student, then you would definitely have the parents and guardians involved. I think addressing your point, and what is a younger student? And that's where it's more vague. Given agency for the principal to decide that, I think.
I just really, and I apologize, Counselor, school committee woman, hers. I just get very frustrated when I see policies that allow us to make decisions without parents. When, to me, a child making a decision around gender identity is such a huge thing. It's a huge decision for them. It comes with a lot of different expectations and just so many challenges even of itself when a child makes that decision. And I just feel very concerned when we allow students to make decisions at such a young age, and things like, I'm just going to throw this out there, like, we don't let people vote till they're 18, but we're letting kids make decisions that are really life-changing. And I'm just very concerned about language that is not encouraging more of a response from or encouragement to engage family. I think if the child is in a situation where they're in a foster home, or they're in a situation where they're in a home where it may be abusive, like, that's a different conversation than somebody who like me, not being told that, like, that just, I don't know.
So I understand. I mean, I understand your concern for sure. I also understand that, I mean, and there have been studies done, and there have been studies done here, right here in our city. And, you are a very active and engaged parent who may or may not be receptive to their child having that conversation. But we know that there are students in our district who don't necessarily have that parental support, that it may be even more oppressing for them to have to come out to their parents and or caregivers. And so, I'm not, an attorney. So Attorney Kennedy, I'd love for you to weigh in. I understand that as a parent, we want to know all of these things, but I also know that not all kids hail from that type of a household where they're able to have open and engaging and receptive conversations like this. I know that there have been conversations or similar conversations that have come up when we passed the health curriculum bill, right? And so when does a parent know when their child goes and sees the nurse and talks about abstinence versus, safe sex and or a variety of other concerns? And so I don't know, is it a law that, there's a particular age? My understanding is that there's not a specific age that has been identified. And so I think that the policy has to be inclusive of all students. And if we drill down and put in a piece that says that parents have to be involved or have to be told, then we're going to exclude students and potentially put them at greater risk of things such as suicide and mental health and all those things that people talk about that, not just students, but even adults contend with when they can't necessarily, be who they determine they are.
Can we put in language that may not mandate that they talk to their parents, but that there's some type of conversation, whether it be the counselor or somebody? Like, I just feel like a child making a decision that severe, it need not be one made in a vacuum. And if that's not the parent, if there's a trust, and like I said, we can't mandate. I don't think that's going to be something that is going to fly. But I think if we can encourage in some way, and I don't know what that language looks like to encourage a conversation, but I think that there needs to be a conversation had before children understand, so that children understand what decisions they're making when they make these decisions. I think a lot of times children make decisions thinking that they know what they're doing, what the outcome is going to be, and then sometimes it backfires. And then they still end up in that bracket of suicidal or depression or what have you, because now they realize that it wasn't what they thought it was, or they're not sure of what to do at this standpoint, or they feel isolated and alone. And so that's the piece of it where I guess I'm coming from, is thinking of a child who is lonely, alone, or not able, or feeling like they have somebody to talk to, and now they're making a decision that could affect them for the rest of their life.
But the way it's written now, this is schools will work. It's not identifying who in the school will have those conversations. And if the person's guidance counselor, if they have a good relation, that's why you give that flexibility. It could be an assistant principal, a guidance counselor, it could be the school nurse, it could be the principal. So we're trying to give some flexibility for the school to decide whether it's appropriate for this student to, it may well be that the parents are involved and know about it, or if they're not, that whether you pull them into it because given the age of the student. Desi was not giving us any guidance of what a younger student is, and we were trying to put some guidance in there that what are we referring to as a younger student. And thought was typically an elementary school student, you're going to be, you would want up to pull that parent or guardian in to have those conversations.
So if we vote on this to accept this as it is written, and a parent finds out that administration was dealing with their child and aware that their child has transitioned or is in process of transitioning and they were not aware, what kind of, I'm thinking about some parents that I know that would totally flip out and not be very happy about the situation. So I don't know. This is a very tough conversation for me because I'm understanding both sides of it, but I'm also feeling like the mom. And I get that I have to acknowledge that there's moms that don't think like me or love like I do. But I also understand that if a parent finds out that they're going in and out of the schools on a daily basis, and then they're finding out a year later or 2 years later that this is happening and they weren't aware. So I wonder how you even hide it from them, because if the kid has to do homework and assignments and stuff and their kid has to change a name, at some point they're going to find out. So I don't know. I just want us to think about that. I mean, I get it.
So a couple of things, and perhaps Attorney Kennedy can weigh in. Right underneath transitions, which is on the screen, and I don't know if you're able to lift it, it does say, oh, no, you've gone too fast. When a student transitions and there is a request, I also think, and I don't know if anybody else knows, my understanding is that there's a difference in identifying versus transitioning. Oftentimes, a person will identify, but they are not able to quote unquote transition, because transition means a lot of different things, such as a name change, such as, physical changes in their appearance or even in their wardrobe. It's a very complex, complicated situation. And so I don't know if when you're reading this particular paragraph that you notice that it does talk about a safe and supportive educational environment, if that's helpful. But, I don't know that the district would would put themselves in any positions of being held liable because they didn't disclose. Like the same way we can't disclose if a child is pregnant or sexually active. Is that accurate? Attorney, are we allowed to disclose those things?
Depending on who it's disclosed to, if it's the, I don't know off the top of my head, but.
Nursing can't disclose it if it was given in confidence because we're held to the law.
Yeah.
So we work closely with counselors who don't necessarily have the same licensing requirements, but I can't speak for a counselor. Our goal is for any student that's pregnant or any student that's transitioning, is to have an adult in their life to communicate with. So in all my years working here for students that have been pregnant, if it wasn't a parent that we could have the conversation with, and it can take months for this to happen.
Right.
It's another adult, because no child can easily go through this without, whether it's a pregnancy or a major change in their life presentation, without support.
Agreed.
But who that support is, I agree with you. I'm a mom too. I get where people want to know. Doing what's right by everyone and putting it in writing is what's hard.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the only other thing that I would say is that, you know, there's also an argument out there that this isn't necessarily a decision, right? That people make. It is something that just is. So, you know, it's definitely complex and it's not easy. I think our role and our task is to ensure how do we make sure that students who don't have the supportive parent that you are, how do we make sure that they still have policies that can help protect them and help guide them, as Jeannie talked about.
Right.
And I think the policies are written to support the student, as Ms. Clancy was saying, that the interest of the student is really what is paramount here, to protect that student and so to have those conversations with the student.
Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, those are great questions and great, Ms. Naylor. I completely, I understand where you're coming from. Any others?
If I may jump in as well, just to
Yes, please, Mr. Grimes.
some of the policy to our priorities, right? So we obviously want to create inclusive environments for our students, and these policies will help that. But also, I think it's worth noting that gender and gender identity can often be fluid at times as well, right? So students who are perhaps transitioning or identifying one way, that can change. There's also gender nonconforming, right? And pronouns that are not the typical traditional he or she, but rather they or ze. And so I think taking all of that into account as well brings it back to what Attorney Kennedy was saying. We really want to make sure we're honoring the students and their preferences, because at the end of the day, it is the students who we are educating and trying to keep safe and supportive. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Ms. Naylor, that the decision, particularly around transitioning, while it may be controversial, especially for the young age of students, right? At least what I've seen in the field of diversity and inclusion, again, is that inclusion piece in that piece is really key, right? Because it creates a sense of belonging. And if I don't want us to refuse, but if we forget to acknowledge and honor their identities, multiple identities, then we may not be creating those spaces. And I think the same argument could be made with other aspects of identity, for example, religion, right? A student who may be raised Catholic or Christian may not agree with that. And again, we still have to honor that. So just wanted to throw out a different perspective when we think about what is gender identity and the various layers.
Thank you.
No.
Okay. I think all my questions have been answered.
All right. So, I mean, thank you. I mean, those are really good.
They were great questions.
And valid, you know, and valid points and perspectives for sure. So, Terry has been so kind to type the motions into the chat for me. So is there a motion to approve the non-discrimination policy on the basis of, non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity policy?
So move.
Second, roll call vote is required.
Yes, Ms. Hurst.
Yes.
Ms. Gresham is absent, and Ms. Naylor?
Yes.
And my apologies, just for clarification, to move this to the full board. Okay, fantastic. All right. And so I think I don't need the agenda. I think that the last item was to review the face covering or the face mask policy. Is that accurate?
Yes.
All right, fantastic.
I don't know if someone can put that up.
Sure.
That would be great. This is a policy we worked with the school reopening team on the face coverings. Although, and it's a policy that we used from the Mass Association of School Committee, but we significantly changed it to address more to address certain things or change wording. This is obviously required, as everyone knows. Face coverings are required in the Commonwealth and by the Governor Baker's order for in various workplaces, and some cities and towns require, if you're in public, to have a face mask. And DESE has required that when students and staff are in the building, they must have a face mask. And that's what the purpose of having this specific policy, because it addresses who is not required to have a face covering. And I don't know if you can make it smaller. That might be easier. Thank you. So certainly there. So the first section says when you're supposed to have your face mask on. It has to be in the school buildings, school offices, school grounds, when school is in session, on school transportation, even when their social distancing is observed. And it applies to all district employees, to students, and to visitors who enter a district building. So it's not just a school building, it is it involves other district buildings, such as central office, PACE, to name just a few. Then we address some concerns about face coverings that might have language or symbols that might be disruptive or cause disorder within the school. Those are not protected under the law, so that we're making sure that those are prohibited. And then consistent with DESE's guidelines, we talked about when you don't have to wear a face covering. And consistent with DESE's guidelines and school reopening, students in pre-K and grade 1 don't have to, but we're recommending that if they can safely and appropriately wear, remove, and handle a face mask, they're encouraged to do so. And then the other individuals, a group of individuals that are exempt from wearing the face mask covering is a student who has a medical, behavioral, or other challenge that makes it unsafe for them to wear a face mask or face covering. We made it very specific about how you get that medical, basically waiver for this, exemption for this, is that the parent just can't say, my child has this medical diagnosis that precludes them from wearing their face mask. They need to get a note from the student's physician that identifies the medical behavior or other challenge that the student may have and why it makes that medical behavior or challenge the student has makes it unsafe for them to wear a face mask covering. And then the principal will sit down with the school nurse or the occupational therapist or and may even pull in Springfield Health and Human Services Department to review to see whether that is an appropriate for that student to be exempt. And it emphasizes again, you just can't have a note from the parent. That's not sufficient. The principal, you have to have a note from a physician. And it's not, and this specifically here is a physician. It's not a nurse. Not, we've identified it as the student's physician. And then the other thing is, if there is an exemption is approved, we're going to still discuss, the principal will discuss with the student's parent or guardian other possible alternatives, such as the use of a face shield or other physical barriers. Again, even if the student is going to be in school without a face mask, we want to make sure that there's maybe another option that could be used to address it. The last one's sort of obvious why someone doesn't have to have a mask. If someone's unconscious, they don't need to have that, or incapacitated, it's appropriate to remove their face mask. Then the section is when you don't have to wear your face coverings. When students are back in school, students will have mask breaks. They're going to be, and they don't have to wear them obviously then when they're taking their mask break, and then while eating or drinking. And if they're outside at recess, they may not have to wear their mask, or if they're in the phys ed class, they don't have to wear their mask. And then the next section talks about whose responsibility is to have, to provide the mask. And the parent or guardians are, but the district will provide, and district staff are required to provide their own face mask covering, but the district will have disposable face coverings when staff or students arrive without a face mask. And the district will also provide students' families with information on how to properly wear the mask and wash the reusable masks. And here's where we made a lot of changes to be consistent with our other district policies, that when there's a violation of the mask policy by a student, it's not going to, you're not going to send the child home. You're going to try to work with positive reinforcement on consistent with the PBIS philosophy, that they're going to talk to the student about getting verbal redirection, then pull the student out and have a more private conversation about the expectations of wearing a mask. If that's not successful, get a counselor to conference with the student, and push it up again, a principal conference with the student. And then if that's not successful in getting the student to continue to wear the mask, the principal will contact the parent or guardian to review those expectations and see whether there's other options that may exist. What's the reason why the student is not wearing the mask? And if that is unsuccessful, then the principal can reassign the student to remote learning until the student can comply with the mask requirements. Unlike students, where we're trying to educate students here, if the district staff are not, their policy, they're just going to be handled in a violation of the policy would be a violation of others, consistent with discipline for other school committee policies. And the visitors will obviously have the same requirements regarding wearing a face mask. So if someone tries to enter the building without a face mask, they're not allowed access. And then this policy will remain into effect until the Springfield School Committee rescinds it. And you can see here the requirements for the face mask coverings. It is set forth by Governor Baker's order to have face mask coverings. CDC recommends face mask coverings, and as well as DESE's requirements as well.
Does anybody, were you all done, Attorney?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Ms. Naylor, any questions?
The question I have is, I don't see a mention of sports. Are we not mandating? I know it says recess and phys ed. Are we mandating them to wear face masks or not during sports, or is it just in the policy that we have for MIAA or whatever that last policy was that we voted on?
The MIAA.
That's a good point. I think this was created before I started drafting this, before school sports were authorized. So I think that,
they are worn during sports, but it's specific to the sport on how it's worn. So if it's cross country, and they're running and there's no one around because it's the length of the course, they're allowed to pull it down while they're running. But soccer players have it on. I have a whole document that spells it out that I can send you, Mary Jo. I'm not sure how you would add it to this. And
yeah, we made it as part of the process, Jeannie. So it's part of the process, Mary Jo, that we put together for procedures with the sports. And so we had to be specific because there's times when they can take them off during sports, and then there's times when they have to have them on during the sports. And each sport had to be specific based obviously on what the students are doing.
I think I could add a sentence that says something to the effect that students will be required to wear face masks consistent with, and then identify the document that you referred to, Jeannie, Ms. Clancy.
It's listed on the MIA website is what we've gone by for our guidance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Ms. Naylor. If you could do that, Attorney Kennedy, that would be really
So if you would allow me the liberty of adding that sentence before the school committee meeting tomorrow, and I can get that to either
Sure.
McCarthy to circulate but that is a great thing.
May I ask a follow-up to that? Just very briefly. So in accordance with particularly what Nurse Clancy and Assistant Superintendent Martinez just said regarding the sports, like, I think part of the reason why I asked is because with recess and phys ed, recess is outside. I'm not really as concerned with them having their mask on and off then, but if there are certain activities that they're doing in phys ed, is it possible that we should be mandating at certain times for them to also wear them during certain aspects of phys ed?
I would agree that if they're not 6 feet apart and they're not outside, that we should clearly follow the same guidelines that we're following under sports. The students have them on. So I'd have to relook at the wording.
Yeah, that would be helpful just to make sure we're consistent, because it could confuse them. If they're in gym and they find they can take them off and run around, they may feel like they can do the same when they start sports, even if we're mandating it.
Do you want to then put it, students participating in school sports and physical education classes, but they wouldn't, consistent with the requirements of the MIAA, but that would not, MIAA doesn't dictate phys ed classes. So.
Right, and I think the language that Nurse Clancy just stated, as far as if they're not a certain amount of feet, 6 feet, or whatever you just said, Nurse Clancy, I think it was perfect.
Well, I think it's what we use in the school. I don't know, we'd have to think how to word it, but, or talk to her, like, I don't know PE well enough to know if they were inside, how much running or physical activity, but they could do like basketball drills. They would still have to be 6 feet apart. And I would say, just like soccer, they're wearing a mask unless they're allowed to pull it down. Clearly, if they're having shortness of breath or can't breathe, the guidelines are clear.
So I would say contingent upon just identifying that wording, Attorney Kennedy, that, you know, if they're engaged in a physical education and they're within that 6 feet, they definitely should have masks on at that point. I think as long as we put some type of wording in just to reflect something similar to that.
Would you be comfortable with, depending on the physical activity, students may not be required to wear face masks during phys ed classes? And leave that up to the either the athletic director or the PE teacher?
I would make sure they're 6 feet apart, even if they're outside.
Right, so maybe add
Even
in that
for
6 feet.
recess.
Add in that
Depending on the
6 feet.
physical activity and social distancing, or
Yes, the social
Yes.
distancing.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is it possible, could we scroll down a bit? Because I have a question. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm saying it incorrectly. Scroll down.
Down or up?
I know, I'm sorry.
Just tell me when.
Yep, go up.
Okay.
Right there, face covering requirements. Can we talk about what does it mean, or what are the specifics around students are prohibited from wearing face coverings that contain language or symbols that cause disruption or disorder? What, do we have specific examples, or is that going to be left, is that subjective?
That is subjective. That is
See that in the MASC one.
That is the language that is in the statute. And so that students have a right to freedom of expression, except to the extent it causes disruption or disorder within the school.
And so is there any guidance that we can give on that? Because that, wouldn't that vary, right? Depending upon who the
Yes.
administrator is
Yes.
or the teacher?
Or what the language is. And that's
Right, or what the language is on the mask.
Could we refer to the harassment policy maybe as far as the language that would be permissible or not?
It's more than just harassment. It's
Or discrimination as
no,
well?
because it's the school, I'd have to pull the statute out, but the statute itself uses the words, the students have a right of freedom of expression or free speech subject to, so long as it doesn't cause the language is so long as it doesn't cause disruption or disorder within the school. That is the statutory, that's
Well,
the state statute.
So to be candid, I guess that's what gives me great pause or some concern, because we know that we're in a really charged landscape. So if a student comes in with a Black Lives Matter mask, is that going to be considered by some a disruption or disorder within the school? Or if a student comes in with a mask that says, all lives matter or blue lives matter, I'm just using that because that is what we are contending with right now in this moment. And so I guess I'm just wondering what sort of guidance are our administrators going to have around whether or not that causes disruption?
It actually has to cause disruption. If someone, I think the way the language is written, if it doesn't cause disruption, then or disorder, then it would not be a violation of that statute. And I'd have to pull the statute out. I want to make sure I'm saying that correctly, Ms. Hurst.
Before we had a uniform policy, this was the language that was relative to like a t-shirt someone wore and what would be disrupting the school environment. It would have been the administrator's judgment, and we'd probably provide some training around it. So something that would be sexually explicit or offensive or that kind of thing would be.
I mean, that's the first thing that I thought of was like the t-shirt example, but we also know that, and I believe that there's even been like litigation around what has been considered disruptive or not. So I just think that with the landscape that we are currently living in, and I know that we aren't in school and it probably may not be an issue, but if for some reason we find ourselves phasing back in and students are still having to wear masks,
right?
What does that mean and what does that look like? Because, everyone sits in really different places and may have a really different opinion as to whether or not one thing is considered disruptive or disorderly.
Well, we could bring the lawyer in, Mary Jo in, and the CSOs and do some training for principals on how to make those calls. But that's always been that way that language has been worded in the past.
And so this is in what statute, Mary Jo? Because I didn't see this in the MASC one, and I say that because I know that it did come up around abridging a student's dress code. So this is in the actual.
It is not in the MASC. It's in the state statute about students' freedom of expression. And so one of the things in the reopening we were talking about was that about the concern of not just people, what are they wearing when they're in school and when remotely, and but as well as the concern if they're not wearing their uniforms, then is it what t-shirt can be appropriate? So that's where we went back in and pulled this in, because the concern was face masks that could have something
right
in there that would be inappropriate.
I just think that it's I just think it would be helpful if we had some specificity or some guidance, and if we're going to do some level of training, that'd be interesting to see. And how and what happens when we're talking about what's called abridging a student's rights. could you speak to that, Mary Jo? Because I know that that did come up in some meetings around our
Yes.
week.
I think that I'll have to pull that out because we did look at this issue, and I sorry, I can't find it right now on my desk, but that I pulled the case law out on that because that was the issue. The concern was that someone comes in with a mask that says something that's inappropriate, and what's the extent of disciplining it? And and a lot of it is it gives a lot of leeway to students for a right of free expression, but as long as it didn't cause disruption or disorder within the school. And it's not just that it may cause it, it's just that, so if someone comes in with a Black Lives Matters mask on, that is, the fact, and there is no disruption or disorder, then then that would not be a violation of this policy at all. And I'm not saying that but I can pull that, if you'd like, I can pull that case out. But even without this in the policy,
because I would think that,
pardon me.
I'm sorry. I just raised it because I could see that I could see it being an issue because I could see someone thinking perhaps that a number of things could be seen as language or symbols that cause disruption or disorder. That's
even all. I'm sorry. Even without that sentence in the policy, that's the standard that we would the students the expression that's on that clothing would need to be assessed by.
Okay. But we could provide training around it so that it's, something like Black Lives Matter wouldn't be what should be going after here.
Exactly.
It would be something that was sexually explicit or something that, would be inappropriate, language like vulgarity, that kind of thing.
Right.
That's what you'd be going after, not.
Okay.
So I think we could provide some training that would keep people, and usually, if a principal gets a question, we'd have them go to the CSO or the attorney in a case. So we'll kind of give the principal support and advice on this.
Okay.
We could do some training, but we always have that other support built in so that folks don't make a judgment that could land us in court,
And going back to the concerns before about there could be something on someone's face mask that could be maybe not meet the disruption or disorder within the school, but it could be bullying or harassing. That would be disciplined under a different policy.
Ms. Naylor, anything?
No, ma'am.
All right. Okay. So is there a motion to bring to the full school committee the policy on face mask coverings?
So moved.
With the caveat.
Sorry, with the caveat.
Subject to the changes being recommended by this subcommittee under the title School Activities During Which Face Coverings Are Not Required to address students participating in school sports and address students in revising the one relating to physical ed.
So moved.
Second, roll call vote is required.
Yes, Ms. Hurst?
Yes.
Ms. Gresham's absent. Ms. Naylor?
Yes.
Oh, sufficient votes, this matter passes. Are there any others that are on the agenda?
No, that's the last one.
That's it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Apologies again for being late.
And I will get you that revised language to Terry, who will then get it to school committee members.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Naylor.
I think when we put this policy in place, Mary Jo and Kim, at a principal's meeting, we can do some training around it.
Yes, sounds terrific.
That's Denise concern. Yeah.
We need a motion to adjourn.
Oh gosh, yes. I'm so sorry. What time is it? Oh, all right.
Time for me to go into another meeting.
I'm sorry. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, roll call vote is required.
Ms. Hurst?
Yes.
Ms. Gresham's absent. Miss Naylor.
Yes.
Thank
And
you,
the school
everyone.
committee meeting is tomorrow, so everyone will be there.
Absolutely.
See you there.
All right.
Thank you,
fantastic.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sorry.